very pleased to be here again in Poland, having come to Poland on and off for quite a few years and having witnessed in Poland the practical embodiment of some of the most profound questions and conflicts about solidarity, nationhood, Europe, secularism, democracy, and the other issues we're discussing today. So it's a great privilege to share some thoughts with you I have today. I won't attempt to fully summarize my paper. It will be available either now or shortly for anyone to read if they wish to do so. I'll simply say what the central theme of the paper was, and then relate that theme to the conversations that we've been having, the dialogue that we've been having up till now today. So I'll try and comment on some of the exchanges with previous speakers and with my interlocutor in this session, whose paper I've also read. The theme of my paper was related to what was a theme in Gianni Vattimo's lecture, which was the idea of unity. There a thought was expressed with which I agree, which is that the pursuit of unity in the world or in society, or even perhaps in thinking, can be dangerous. It can provoke various evils and will in any case fail. My paper was concerned not so much with the pursuit of unity as with the belief which emerged sometime perhaps in the 18th century and was strong in the 19th and 20th centuries and has been influential even in the 21st century, the belief in unity as a political condition which will emerge from the process of modernization. To put it in a different way, there has been a dominant secular belief that the process of modernization, or even history as a whole, can, in normal circumstances, only have the result of producing a universal or a near universal convergence on a single type of political system. Now, there's never been any agreement about what this system would be. If you go back to the 19th century, Marx thought it would be egalitarian communism, Herbert Spencer thought it would be laissez-faire capitalism, Auguste Comte thought it would be a kind of neo-feudal industrial hierarchy, John Stuart Mill thought that it would be a complex system of liberal democracy. So there were radically different conceptions or visions of what this end state would be. But the idea that there would be an end state, not inevitable, none of these thinkers were historical determinists. All of them kept open the possibility that the process of convergence could somehow be retarded or even derailed. But short of such disasters and apart from contingent difficulties, each of them believed that somehow it was part of what it means to be modern. It was a kind of categorical imperative of modernity that it would eventually produce a universal or a near universal regime, that most countries in the world, as they became more modern, would become more similar and they would become more alike. So there was essentially a kind of one unity was at the end of the historical process, not as an inevitable end, but as the normal result of modern historical development. Now, this belief was dressed up as science, as social science. Of course, in Marxism, it was dressed up as later on at least, and perhaps in Marx himself, certainly in Engels, as a science of historical materialism. In Spencer, it was dressed up as a sociological theory of industrialism and of survival of the fittest between different regimes or systems of production. It was Spencer, not Darwin, who invented the phrase survival of of the fittest. And even in Mill, it was thought that a future type of social science would be developed which, so to speak, empirically demonstrated that only one type of regime could ultimately prevail throughout the world or most of the world. So it was supposed to be science, but in my view it wasn't science, it was a secular replica of Christian theodicy. Because the idea that history is a teleological process, that history has any kind of end state, that it's not simply like the seasons, a set of recurrent cycles, as for example, pre-Christian Europe believed, the Greeks and the Romans. If you read the Roman historians, there's no idea of universal history, and certainly not of a teleological history. It's not there at all. If you read the Indians and the Chinese, it's not there either. It's essentially a Christian idea, even different in some respects, I think, as Shlomo said, from Jewish ideas actually as well. And in other words, what this idea of eventual regime convergence, very influential, not only in the 19th century, but at the end of the 20th century in Fukuyama's argument that only one type of government or one type of system, namely democratic capitalism, is the only one that was ever going to be legitimate in future, very influential, and did give some, so to speak, intellectual support to interventions in Iraq and elsewhere. This idea is in fact a replica of a theological commitment. And in other words, it's not based on evidence, it's a faith commitment. And a surprising amount of Western policy is actually faith-based rather than based on empirical estimates of the success or otherwise of different policies in promoting different goals or values. And this brings me to my three comments on the dialogue, as it were, that we've had up till now in these discussions. The first of them, my three comments, relates directly to what I've said just now, which is the continued ubiquity of faith and the ambiguities of secular culture and of secular thinking. I think the very idea of secularity, the very idea of a secular culture or of secular thinking is much more problematical and almost enigmatic than we suppose. Because what happened with the growth of secular thinking was not that the categories of thought which shaped Christian thinking were abandoned, but the beliefs were. The categories of thought in many cases persisted. And among those categories of thought was the very idea that history is a teleological process, a meaningful process, even a process of redemption. It's the idea that history had a kind of redemptive aspect built into it, with all of its tragedies, difficulties, breakdowns, crimes, horrors. There was a kind of redemptive feature in it, and even liberal rationalists held a kind of view rather like this. Maynard Keynes, the British economist, wrote a rather wonderful short essay called My Early Beliefs, in which he treats his early self more or less as an idiot. He says that when I was a young man, I believed the following things and so on. Now I know that most of my earlier beliefs were nonsense. And one of the things which had always struck me is he said of Bertrand Russell, he said he was one of the most intelligent people he'd ever met. He said, Bertie, he says, this isn't one of his lectures, reprinted as an essay, My Early Beliefs. He said, Bertie believes two remarkably incompatible things. He said, first of all, Bertie believes that history up till now has been a nightmare of horror and crime. He said, but the solution is simple. People should simply start being reasonable. Now, that's not exactly, it's a kind of redemptive act of reasonableness which will suddenly intervene, almost like the divine intervention into history which Christians believe occurred, and transform history. Maybe not at once, but transform it. And that view is, I think, not found in pre-Christian European history or in lots of non-Western histories. They assume that the history of the future will be much as like the history of the past. There may be new technologies, there may be new forms of communication, changes in language, different imperial power structures, but the essential forms of ethical and political conflict will remain unchanged. So my first point would be about the ubiquity of faith, but the faiths which have been ubiquitous, as it were, in the last couple of centuries actually haven't primarily been, at least in Europe, traditional religions, Judaism or Christianity, for example, but secular offshoots, secular replicas, secular avatars, if you like, of monotheism, and in particular of Christianity. And it's in a way the retreat of those secular religions, which is, I think, one of the background factors with the revival of traditional religion in many countries. Namely that as these secular replicas, which preserve the categories but not the beliefs of Christian thinking, weaken and crumble or are compromised or no longer believable because of the failure of communism, because of the failure of the failures of democratic, sort of imperial democratic liberalism to reproduce democracies in various parts of the world. Traditional religions, it's one of the reasons, not by any means the only one, resume their role in public life and become once again centers or sites of conflict, even in societies which have otherwise been highly secularized. When I began my academic work in the late 1960s, early 70s in Britain, every single book that I was instructed to read assumed as an axiom that secularization would be ongoing in Europe and the world as a whole. Every single book that I was taken as a kind of axiom of academic discussion, of social theory, of any kind of serious thinking. And I think it's not proved to be the case, because even in societies which are secularized by conventional social scientific standards, that's to say not many people go to church, they don't respect rituals and so on, or they may not declare beliefs, even in those societies, issues which are essentially religious issues, and even explicitly religious issues, have re-emerged. And the key thing is, I think, that religious allegiance has become a matter of identity again. Religious allegiance, with Christians saying, I'm a Christian, it's a key point that I'm a Christian, or I'm not a Christian, I'm an atheist, is the key point. That's why I think the following things, and I'm going to enter into political life and attempt to embody this identity and defend it against attacks upon it, which from other sources. So in fact, religion has actually become, re-entering political life, a form of identity politics in Europe, which I don't think many people expected. They thought that the identity politics would be really within the category of nationalism, and of course to some extent it is still, and certainly in Poland, within the category of nationalism, but it's also in Britain and elsewhere independent of it. So faith has remained ubiquitous. Now, along with that, and this is my second point, ideology has not gone away. I mean, one or two of the contributors here have suggested that we're in a kind of post-ideological circumstance in which we just have bureaucratic rules or the assertion of power. Now, of course, there's some truth in that. But I think actually, if you look at the language with which policies are defended, such as the welfare state and others, to the extent that they are defended at all, it's essentially an economic language inherited from neoliberalism. It remains the only functioning discourse, or the predominant prevailing discourse in politics. And the types of policies that are being adopted in many countries, including most European countries, as a response to the economic crisis. I'm not necessarily saying that there are alternatives or that can be worked out at this stage, or I'm not making any comment on that. Maybe there are, maybe there aren't. But I'm merely making the observation that the policies that are discussed and contested are discussed and contested predominantly in a language inherited from neoliberalism. The ways of thinking are inherited, so we need more privatization, more fiscal orthodoxy, we need to do more marketization. In other words, the central categories are still what they've been for the last 20 or 30 years. That the conquest of politics by neoliberal thinking, which began in the 1980s, remains, even though the problems that we're dealing with might not really be soluble in that way. Now, some people have asked, perhaps I can be allowed to be slightly mischievous here, some people have asked, well, why is it that economics has not changed? That was a question which Ivan Krastev, and I think he might share my view that while economic theory is not particularly useful in predicting market behavior, it's rather powerful in predicting the behavior of economists. That's to say, there are many economic reasons for reproducing a certain type of what they might call intellectual capital, connected with their own role in particular institutions, but there's maybe an even deeper reason. And this takes us to China, which is, takes me to China, which has recurred as several points in our conversation today. If you read economic historians and economic theorists, and you try to get the most sophisticated and plausible account of why and how economic growth or capitalism in the broadest sense develops, what you will find if you put the ideologues on one side, if you put Milton Friedman and Hayek on one side and look at even kind of relatively unideological historians, they will all say that what you need for capitalism and rapid economic growth is a rule of law and settled property rights. Now, my observation is that neither of these exist in China. There is no effective rule of law in China, and there are no settled property rights in China. And yet, despite that, there has been the largest and fastest industrialization in human history. So this is an enormous, if you like, an elephant in the room of Western economic theory. How can this be possible? And so that's another reason why I think economics as a whole, there may be some economic thinkers to whom this does not apply, has not really had anything useful to say about the crisis. So we still actually, in a sense, talk and think in terms of an ideology which we, so to speak, are half consciously aware does not describe the world and doesn't really adequately comprehend the world, in which the world is already falsified, actually. History is already falsified, but we have no alternative. And that, I think, generates this kind of peculiar cognitive dissonance which we have at the moment, which is that we're aware that our categories and ways of thinking don't work, but we carry on using them despite that because we have no functioning alternatives. Now, my third of these three thoughts suggested by our dialogue might seem, and perhaps even is, inconsistent with the first two, because the third is the persistence of heterogeneity, and particularly there might be a conflict here with the second thing I mentioned, which is the persistence of ideology, because we still have, so to speak, semi-universal ideological claims are often made. If you read commentary on China, for example, quite a lot of Western economists say the laws of economics apply in China. There will be a crash. House prices are too high, etc. And I'm not denying that there may be a crash. I'm not denying. I mean, I think it would actually be foolish to assume that this present experiment in China is immune to crisis. If it did crash, by the way, that doesn't mean that Western capitalism, American or Anglo-Saxon or European versions, would necessarily get stronger. Because the challenge to those doesn't only come from China. It comes from Brazil, it comes from, I would think even down the road, it might come from Africa, it comes from India. The shrinkage in West is not only a phenomenon of China. But I'm interested that there is still a powerful discourse around which says there are universal laws of economics and these are operating in China, so there will inevitably, these people say, be a crash. I think there might be a crash, but it'll be for contingent reasons, and it'll be strongly resisted by the elite, by the communist elite, which still remains pervasive, powerful, and young, a lot of it. It's not just an aging gerontocracy. So there could be a crash, but there's nothing inevitable about it. But it may seem inconsistent to talk about the persistence of universalistic thinking and the persistence of heterogeneity. Well, let me cite, I think, the greatest 20th century Enlightenment thinker who observed it is only in contradiction, it is only in logic that contradictions are forbidden. I don't know if any of you know that was Freud, the greatest 20th century Enlightenment thinker. In the real world, and even in human thinking, contradictions abound. And what do I mean by the persistence of heterogeneity? I'll just say a few things about this and then conclude. First of all, I think there's great heterogeneity within the non-West and within Asia. Somewhat different from the accounts of China which have been given by others. My impression of China is that at this stage of development, it is a strongly Hobbesian state. That's to say, the state institutions are extremely powerful and all-pervasive. They exist at every level of the society. There are some Hobbesian traditions in Chinese thought, legalism. If you go back to the theories of the rectification of names, the idea was that language would be changed by the state. That's, by the way, directly parallel to what Hobbes himself argued. He argued that, as a sort of early Derridean deconstructionist, he argued that the Bible had no internal meaning, no inner meaning. The meaning was what the sovereign gave it. And the reason he adopted that view was that if everyone accepted the sovereign's meaning, there would be no conflict, there'd be peace. But it's a kind of early Derrideanism, because he said inherently these marks on the pages or these words have no meaning. They're given a meaning by an act of will. That was more or less what the legalists also thought. My also impression is Chinese society is extremely weak. Compared, for example, with society in Taiwan, or in Japan, or in India, which are also parts of the non-West. But a kind of weak society. So the non-West is extremely diverse and heterogeneous, just as the West is, and just as Europe itself is. And one or two brief comments on Europe. I entirely endorse the drift to the comments of Shlomo Avineri and others, but particularly Shlomo on Europe today. I mean, the history of the last few years has really been the history of a type of transnational utopianism coming up against the fact that the one institution which has deep democratic authority is still the nation state. There's nothing above it. There are one or two transnational nation states, Spain, Britain, Canada, but they're all relics of monarchy or empire. One of the paradoxes of cosmopolitanism and of transnationalism is it seems best achieved in antique institutions. Modern institutions seem to develop towards nation states, and I interpret China in a sense, like Japan in the 19th century, as involved in a project, in some ways a kind of rather cruel and harmful project, but nonetheless it's bent upon it for reasons of survival to some extent, of turning itself into a modern nation state, which is what Japan did in the Meiji period in the 19th century and what China is doing now. And that involves ironing out ethnic differences, not only in Tibet and in regions of China, but in the whole country, and creating a semi-fictitious past, which affects things like museums in China, whereby they say China has always been a unitary national culture, even 3,000 years ago, which is absolutely not true, by the way, but which is part of the current process of nationalism and replicates what was done in Europe when nation states, they equipped themselves, were invented and equipped themselves with semi-fictional or entirely fictional histories. But China is not Taiwan, and China is not Japan, and Japan is not India, and none of these Asian countries is Brazil, and they're all different. So I think we should try and avoid imagining that the non-West is homogeneous in a way that we are not and are not going to become. What happens in Europe, Marchand suggested we'll be sort of forecasting the future. Well, I think Woody Allen had one good comment on that. You know, prediction is always difficult, especially when it concerns the future. But I would only make one comment. I don't believe the fiscal problems of Greece and beyond Greece, Spain, I don't believe these problems are soluble within existing institutions. I don't believe that they can be staved off, there can be more bailouts, there can be various kinds of mitigating policies which will undoubtedly be adopted, because the consequences of a breakdown in the euro are quite large. The ripple effects on the rest of it are really quite large, even if it was only one or two. There'll be enormous attempts. Every conceivable resource will be mobilized to prevent an actual breakdown or exiting of any country from the euro, because of the integrity of the whole system. But I doubt that these can be successful, partly for the reason that was suggested, which is that nothing like a European polity has been generated, nothing like European democratic solidarity has been created. There is no European demos, and there won't be. So that there won't be anything in Europe that resembles the United States, a very successful experiment in nation building, but which is successful partly because, putting the indigenous inhabitants on one side, it was a nation of voluntary, largely voluntary immigration, and putting the slaves aside as well, of course. Europe is long settled and has many internal conflicts. The countries in it are at very different levels of economic and other types of development. I think essentially the institutions we've inherited now, not those that were built after the war, which worked very well and worked for 20, 30 years, have become brittle utopian structures which are in the process of breaking down. So the question is how that breaking down. At the end of it, you might have a smaller Europe which is more stable and more resilient and more robust, or you might have a larger crisis. But I don't believe that these institutions are fixed, permanent features of the European landscape. And I don't share the view which, for example, Oskar Fischer developed a year or two ago and perhaps long held, which is that a crisis was inevitable but would push these institutions further to deep integration. That was the theory. He said there will be a crisis, and the result of the crisis will be, well, we've had the crisis. And further crisis has been staved off, but I don't think it's possible, ultimately because the root of democratic solidarity and democratic authority and democratic legitimacy remains within nation states. So it will break down in one way or another. So what is the larger future now? What I want to avoid is, I think it's a very silly theory, I want to avoid any theory, any Huntington-like theory of clash of civilizations, for a couple of reasons, and then I'll close. One reason is I read Professor Huntington's book. Maybe I'm saying that there will be heterogeneity in the world, but it will not only be, or perhaps even primarily be, civilizational. I think the idea of clashing civilizations is a mistake for several reasons. I read Professor Huntington's book, not just the original articles, but the book 2 or 3 times. One of my points of curiosity was how many civilizations there are. How many different groups, human groups, you can belong to this honorific club, which makes you a civilization. And at one point I counted 13, but by the time I got to the end of the book, 1 or 2 dropped out. Greece had dropped out for some reason. Japan had been absorbed in China. Jews were in for a moment, but then they dropped out. I then asked myself, what is a civilization? And I sort of concluded that actually civilization for Professor Huntington was an American minority. That really the book wasn't about the world at all. It wasn't about the international system. It was about American multiculturalism. It was a projection onto the world screen, onto the global scene, of anxieties about American nationhood and multiculturalism. And that's a great danger, I think. And I think it's a great danger working with civilizations exist. I don't think there's going to be a universal civilization, but they're not windowless monads a la Leibniz. They interpenetrate, they're internally fragmentary. There's been a tremendous amount of immigration. All European countries now are to some significant extent deeply multicultural. So none of them can be seen as forming part of an integral West anymore. Furthermore, Latin America is developing in some different directions, and I'll conclude now. And America's, I think, despite its close defense links and so on, which are perhaps closer now than they were for a long time, is developing in other directions from Europe. So my conclusion is really heterogeneity or diversity is our fate. And so the path of wisdom lies not in resisting it, or I would say even regretting it, but learning to cope with it and even, to some extent, enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation to that conference, and I think that I am here partly because I was, 30 years ago, I was in this Gdańsk shipyard witnessing this very incredible phenomenon of deep epistemological, let's say, revolution. I would say that it was a rapid activation and, let's say, elevation of moral concepts to role of the tools of both articulating conflict and moral, let's say, identity of individual, and it was done, I use in my book on solidarity, method was the bricolage way of Levi-Straussian type of change, mental change, when experience of high risk with emotions involved, experience of defending not material interests, but weak workers, for the sake of value orientation, elevated concepts to play the role of new cognitive tools, new for such working class community. And of course it was a source for anti-political utopia of society and state operating without politics, and it was also this new articulation of conflict, good fighting evil. But at the same time, it was an example how assets of your own tradition, it was in a very visible way exploitation of assets of Thomistic realism, activation of that tradition, and in a sense it was showing that the beginning of it was Camus type rebellion, when you change your relationship to yourself with this discovery of inner dignity, and later on that movement with strong ontological justification of the dignity in realist version of Christian religion, it was this shift towards justice. And that narrative was very strong, and in a sense it was instant shift from, let's say, Hegelian indifferent variety towards sort of community. And my book, Self-Limiting Revolution, was trying to grasp that phenomenon. And let's say 25 years after that experience, in my last book, Anthropology of Power, I described the lack of correspondence of such perspective, mental perspective, unable to grasp this post-nominalist pattern of regulation that was visible in the Lisbon Treaty. And it was very pathetic experience, this lack of correspondence, in a sense. And again, deeply rooted in our traditions, this lack of autonomy of form that is not existing when you are not going through the nominalist breakthrough. This very strong stress on the natural law, hierarchical concept of order. When Lisbon Treaty, that was extremely, I am saying was because economic crisis added to its collapse, Lisbon Treaty was extremely interesting experiment in, one would say, post-Kantian execution of practical reason, when it started with, as I said in my short remarks during our discussion, syncretic space of parallel, colluding normative systems, and treated as equally justified. And it added two instruments that were for the first time trying to make sort of an institution of Kantian practical reason, namely economy of norms, making possible to build individual combination of different intensity of particular norm, and quite new ontology of law with many possibilities of its existence. And power was located in very, not concealing its arbitrary character, in very Hobbesian way around border conditions that were, in a sense, sort of a delimitation of possible variety of individual combinations of norms. And it was very interesting document, not only because it was elaboration of multivariant logic, not just because concept of difference was not useful anymore, but it was also, it could be grasped by this famous Nicholas from Cusa statement that your identity, you are what you are able to make out of your inner contradictions. But of course it was cancelled by economic crisis. Eurozone is now closing up in its much more homogeneous space without necessity to create such a sophisticated instrument meant for complexity. Homogeneous space of Eurozone is again sort of a system, not complexity anymore. And of course, crisis added again to different experiment of integration, namely this authoritative developmental state, supra-state, and of course, example of Greece. If Greece would go out of Eurozone, it would be example for Bavaria, who was opting for very same solution in order to save German state. Because it is experiment of Eurozone as exciting as Lisbon Treaty, but it is different, and of course we post-communist countries are now excluded. But everybody else who is treating that crisis as sort of a lesson and possibility to pacify its middle classes and to introduce very risky experiments is doing it for the sake of global competition. Of course, again, not us. In United States, we observe elements of garrison state with, let's say, garrison state budget excluded from political control. Even in China, in some Asian countries, we observe, I call it military form without militaristic content, but military logistic technology as axis of coordination. And of course, China. China was present all the time, so I would not talk about China. But in a sense, it is different pattern of integration. But I have to say that it was very sad that from the point of view of our perspective, the very same perspective that made possible to build up as community, who was necessary vehicle to create collective subject during solidarity time, and I think perspective that is useful for the future. My comments on religion as above all attitude to yourself and necessity to have much stronger than post-secular foundation for your claims for human dignity, I think are very important for the future. But from the point of view of such operation as adjustment to Lisbon Treaty, it was very sad to watch how it was much easier to explain and to obtain applause. In Tokyo during conference on Lisbon Treaty, I was able to attend last autumn, because for them it was reminiscent of Kyoto School, of very similar patterns, that you are building integration on a meta level and you create a possibility for individual combinations, and each country is following its own suchness without notion of difference. And acceptance of such epistemology was enough to integrate. The same was in Lisbon Treaty. They were enthusiastic about Lisbon Treaty, but of course not us. So from my point of view, of course I am also against clash of civilization, because I think that we observe very complex process of mutual learning. It is not only that complexity and network character of both power apparatuses that have to adjust to network character of society and economy, but we observe some crawling elements of Asian approach to power without hierarchy. But we observe also the opposite type of learning, and in a sense, even our meeting, I use that phrase, counter-reformation of atheists, with recognition that, in a sense, in order to operate in multicultural world, we have to understand phenomenon of faith, not independently of content, And secondly, that we have to think about this visible fact that society should no longer be taken for granted, and even Europe we observe such a segmentation that perhaps in the future only consortional type of democracy would work, with opinion polls calculating quantity of such and such constituency and proportions of eventual elites would substitute political actors. And of course, I think that from that point of view, thinking about these differences of perspectives on order, different epistemology of order in each civilization, and its interactions should be of sort of interest. And I want to use quotation from, and I think that Professor Lash would appreciate, from Professor Hughes from Oxford. Of course, he is not among us anymore. That remark was made in 49, when communist China was born. During conference on Chinese mind, he didn't mention communism. For him, it was just episode. And he was right to some extent, but his remark was on difference between China and the West. And he said that China built its ontology already two millennia and more during his classics, and adjusted its concept of power, its perpetuum mobile of power, and its concept of individual to unavoidable ambiguity or uncertainty. And his following remark was that Europe or Western culture built the same ontology only in the Middle Ages. And later on he said, well, I would not go on, you know, all these colleagues were as excellent as he was, and said, I would not follow, you know. I did not know, and I spent obsessively a few weeks thinking which stage of Middle Ages in Western culture was similar. And of course it was nominalist breakthrough with same, in a sense, concealing of universals, this multi-level reality, slightly introduced problem of correspondence, similar as in Asia, but difference was that West was trying to cancel, to eliminate that ambiguity and uncertainty. And problem today is that all of this movement of ideas and all this pattern of thinking from Hobbes, arbitrary power, as Lisbon Treaty, concentrated on border conditions to limit variety of individual systems of norms. Later on, all these forms of agreements, Rousseau, civil society, had different versions. Later on, Kantian solution of reconstructing universals, but of course without believing, just as assumptive reality. All of it is not efficient enough. And our problem today is how to operate in a world without, in a sense, strong point of departure, power without hierarchy. And paradox is that our own tradition, I think about this realist tradition of Thomistic version, pre-nominalist, because some Central European countries didn't go through the nominalist breakthrough. Baltic states to some extent through Sweden. So their ability to understand European Union is much deeper than ours. The problem is that we are at the same time unable to understand and to operate in a very efficient way, but we have at least this narrative to keep society going. this connection between dignity and justice. But I want to add, of course, some of you, I am talking of to people from, not from Poland, but people from, to other panelists, we are watching with curiosity that conflict over cross facing presidential palace in Warsaw. Of course, it was not only politics. It was the second interesting phenomenon following this initial lack of correspondence of our tradition and some doubts about short-term efficiency of the tradition. It was very interesting phenomenon of crawling and selective and a very pastiche and very simplistic introduction of some elements of nominalist approach. For instance, it was a statement from Catholic Church, somebody who was Catholic Church priest, saying, well, that cross, explaining why church was not active, he was saying, well, that cross, meaning it was de-substantialization of cross. He was saying, well, in state space, it is not cross anymore. It is not, it is just a sign of something. It is only in different space, it has its deep meaning. And of course, it was very strong step against such realistic approach. Of course, it was followed by all these claims to have different pattern in public and private arena. And of course, our tradition is facing two problems: lack of correspondence to institutional, post-nominalist system. On the other hand, this inner corrosion. But at the same time, it has its energy. And it was really incredible. And I think that memory of solidarity, it was really instant. I did not believe in my own book, Self-Limiting Revolution, published by Princeton University Press, written in English, because at that time it would be impossible to write such things in Polish. I was showing my skepticism, saying it is not possible to change yourself in such an instant way. But it was possible. And I think that in order to understand what is possible when you believe, we have to, in order to communicate with Islam, with different religions, we have to start with epistemology. I am not talking about religion. I am at that moment neutral in terms of content, but epistemology of faith, different attitude to yourself, different obligation, different justification of the same value system. A Lisbon Treaty has freedom, dignity, justice as well as, but it is different organization and different justification, and it makes difference, not list of values. So my final comment is that, of course, I am very, I spent quite a long time in China, of course, not knowing Chinese, but reading everything that was translated from their classic writing and teaching and talking, etc. And I highly appreciate their adaptness of their culture to the present dilemma of network society. Their obligation of course it is very risky from the point of view of their individual situation, because they have to build themselves into person by long way of thinking about thinking, recognition of own suchness, specific perspective, and later on they have to look for somebody else, for different suchness, and to build knowledge together. In their case, process of building society is process of building knowledge. It is fascinating for somebody who is thinking about himself as intellectual. It is this discipline, this loneliness of thinking. But at the same time, they are stripped of this strong ontological justification of their rights. And I think it is real difference. At the same time, they have this ability to understand, I call it ontologization of time, to understand this processual character, to absorb conflicts as just different point of view, articulating different aspects. It is natural way of integration, of, I spoke to Professor Lash because I understand your enthusiasm, but I understand as well position of these people. Even this few days ago, we have this Nobel Prize for dissident. Of course, from the point of view of slightly cynical, let's say, ex-dissident of Central Europe like me, I understand that, first of all, this 11 years in prison, for such a moderate person, somebody else who was in his group obtained only 3 years, it means for somebody who was saying order of one-party system is better than chaos without, of democracy, who is saying that transition should combine revolution from above and from below, means that they will try very soon democratization of sort of the round table, because they need this other side. They have to invest in him with repressions. It is sort of investment to build his up. And of course it is very hard way. They understand that waiting for too long with democratization, they will lose this energy, this emotional capital of people who are this joy of freedom and dignity. Because very soon these people, Chinese people, would recognize that systems are too complicated to be, that democratization is in a sense sort of a facade. And that their parliament, recognizing twice a year in what stage of development is their country is at that moment, and what type of legal recommendations should be made, is in a sense much more efficient and should be kept. Of course, it has nothing to do with liberal democracy. It is based on merit. So I think that our experience is treated, even in China, as at least necessary to, that dignity is creating sort of energy in people, to move, to try, to be optimistic. And my last sentence, our society, much more peripheral now after crisis than before. Gap is growing. Eurozone would jump, it would be technological jump if Merkel and Sarkozy, being now under attack, would be successful. Of course, states would be gone, it would be something new. But for us, it means to be left behind. We would be not able to follow the new cycle of globalization because our price paid for that crisis is structural technological regress of our economy. But we are optimistic, and part of it is that people have this support in themselves. And part of it is this myth of combination, ontological justification of your dignity, that you should concentrate on yourself, your own strategy, independently of what is going on. And it is part of survival, not just food, housing, but also to be good with yourself. And I think that that lesson would be useful even for Western societies. Thank you.
Since Professor Gray seemed to agree with most I have said about Europe and the nation. I am vain enough to agree with most of what he has said. But I have a small little caveat. At the end of your talk, you said that there was no point in resisting globalization or multiculturalism or whatever. It was a matter of coping with. The only thing I would add that coping with may involve resisting at sometimes. We are told that jihad is not warfare, but just spiritual warfare. And perhaps Europe at some point may have some need for jihad in the sense of spiritual warfare. I mean, it's not self-evident for me that being simply open to any culture, any effect of globalization by itself is simply good. And to say a word about the elephant, the growing elephant in the European room, it's not yet self-evident for us in Europe that the Muslim immigration has meant such a progress of European culture and civilization. Perhaps it's our fault, but I am not simply sure that it's our fault. So I would just plead only for the possibility that being open to the necessity of globalization is perhaps part of wisdom. It's certainly part of wisdom, but it's not the whole wisdom. And perhaps, or maybe, there may be some place in the future for, well, preserving at least our spiritual integrity.
I still think that attempting to reverse, actually reverse a process of internal diversification of European societies, rather than coping with its dangers, which include terrorism, which attempting to sort of reverse it is, I think, not terribly feasible or desirable. One reason is that many countries, the Netherlands, for example, France, Britain, have substantial immigrant populations, most of whom are actually citizens. And so the question, really, the practical question is one, it seems to me, of modus vivendi, and therefore, and that includes security issues, it includes resisting terrorism, because essentially terrorism can be seen in all of these cases. And of course terrorism in Europe has, over the last 30 years, not been predominantly Islamic. It's been Basque and Irish. It's been nationalist, actually, but it's now partly Islamist. Is an attack on the type of, let's say, civilization that has developed in Europe. So I'm sort of skeptical about the idea of a European jihad. Let me just mention one kind of, I was asked to take part in a European Union committee on the role of religion in Europe. I refused. And the reason I declined was I expected it to come up with a nonsensical formulae. And it did, because the French delegates didn't want the word religion used. They wanted the word spirituality or values. Other delegates from Germany wanted the word religion used, but some wanted Christianity, others didn't. There was great debate on what European values were. You know, is the question of what European values are, isn't it a historical question? If it was historical, it would have to include racism. Or is it a normative decision, and in which case do you get this? I don't think this is really, I don't think there will be a kind of normative version of the European project which will crystallize all these different tendencies. So I tend to have a more modest objective. With modest objective is to resist, certainly certain things have to be resisted, and among them are terrorism. So that involves making certain issues non-negotiable. For example, one issue which should be non-negotiable is free speech. People who speak can't be then threatened with fatwa or their death. That has to be taken as a non-negotiable issue, and therefore they have to be defended, and so on and so forth. But the idea of coalescing around some normative project, I think, is very far from any reality and involves a variety of risks which I think are not worth taking.
I suppose the main thing I want to put on the table is questioning the necessity of the notion of nation, because it's been kind of, Shlomo and John have spoken in some ways as if things haven't changed for 50 years or whatever, or 60. And in China, for example, there's a big debate about is it nation, is it what that China is, yeah? For example, the Kyoto School of historians argues that the Song dynasty between 900 and 1300 was when China consolidated as a nation. But of course, Japan wants to impose a kind of a national model on that and have used it for various for their own ends a lot of times. Is China a civilization? Is it an empire? Is it a nation? That's a tough question. I think we need to keep it open. I don't think that the structure of the world now is what it was as a system of nation states with Europe at the center. I think what you've got now is something a lot more like continents, like China, India, Brazil, Russia, the United States, and Europe, I guess, even though Europe has got big problems. I do think that your solution is probably right. I mean, if Europe has to make it as a civilization, partly because at the moment it's not an aggressive force, but I do think that Europe as a civilization has to be does better through being multicultural, really, to be honest, as you know what John's suggesting. And we'll have, I think, more force in being like that than in not being like that. One little point is that I can't be so pessimistic as John again. I mean, I think that first of all, there is a sort of neo-Keynesian. I mean, Summers became a neo-Keynesian all of a sudden. You know, Larry Summers, and he's out of the government. Austin Goolsbee is now moving into a situation of advice for Obama. I think what's going on economically is a lot more complex. I think Greece probably will restructure their debt and an effective bankruptcy in 3 years, but still be part of the euro. I also think that, and I'll give my mic up, where you're probably right, you guys are right, and you're right, is that the difference between Shanghai and Beijing on the one hand, and Gansu in Western China is much more than between Germany and Greece.
I have a question which goes in a certain way to two of you. Judge Holmes once said that in the relations between two persons, there are always 6 actors. The way the persons view themselves, the way they view the others, and the way they are viewed by God. I'm saying this because in a certain way, if I'm listening carefully, it's easy to say that we are accepting that we are living in the multipolar world. It's not the problem of acceptance. It means that you should redefine your culture and the culture of the others in order to function in this world. It is not simply accepting it. In a certain way, we cannot live with the same idea about what is Europe or European Union, accepting the multipolar world. 10 years ago, we believed that European Union is the model of the future. Post-national, kind of a post-modern project which everybody is going to follow. So now we know that China is not post-modern anyway. So from this point of view, my question is going to be, to what extent for Europe, and especially for the European Union, is going to be more difficult than for the others, even for the United States, to adopt to multipolar world, which normally we view normatively in a quite good way. And secondly, this is a reverse of a tradition of 500 years in which Europe was the center of the world. For the first time, we're recognizing that we are periphery. And I do believe that this is one thing to say that we can resist or not resist it. The problem is that simply accept it is not going to be enough. How we should rethink our tradition in order to feel comfortable in the periphery.
Not as European Union, with us, only as Eurozone, because its strengths are institutions. And in a sense, this ability to learn and to treat state as just transitory forms that you can now, and now they are trying to overcome. But we are in a different state. Problem of European Union is that we are in a different stage of history, not only because of tradition. And I think that it is, I think nominalist is your question, I think about Odom and all this rejection of universals and Thomistic realism and not hierarchical, natural law, multi-level reality, Lockean recognition of freedom as cognitive situation. Things we do not, in our situation and in a sense, our approach, this Thomistic realism, maybe is much more useful in our situation because we can create, our own type of rules. But together we are weaker, and I am sad to say it. But it is visible in Eurozone, and in that sense, I think that it would be different architecture after crisis. And of course, this question on China, I would never use this word or state or nation. Not only 100-something ethnicities, but also this conscious self-consciousness as area to be somehow not colonized, but integrated by moving capitals, Tibetan dynasties are much better to understand that specific, much more processual concept of empire. And not uniformization, but just keeping these meta rules of correspondence to own time and space. It is individualization, I think, but some border conditions of loyalty, of some, defense and loyalty above all. But it is something different, and now everywhere it is something different, and I think that democracy. I watch political changes in the United States from the point of view of finances, budget, of who is in charge of this $800 billion, going for dual-use technology. And because I was also for quite a long time in Hokkaido University studying their asymptomatic militarization of 50s and 60s, it was specific center of command, combining military, part of administration, below politics, part of industry and part of science. And it was very specific instrument, not destroying market allocation, but being able to concentrate on such or such pattern of investment. And very similar structure is now developed. Obama has nothing to do it. He's just a screen to some extent, of course, fighting, but in many Western countries, we, for the first time, observe this open clash between political and military elites, including Britain, including, above all, in the United States. Also, of course, Russia, China, it is under control. But United States, for the first time, open contestation. It is signal of this garrison state with different articulation. So I think that everything is changing, bad for us, bad for Bulgaria, Poland, Romania, and all of us. But we will be happy with our assets. I am not joking. We could be happy if we integrate, if we follow this Chinese advice to build institution and pattern of capital formation corresponding to your assets and to your local advantages. It is possible. We could be better off in a way, I think.
I think the last example we had was immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. Francis Fukuyama was perhaps the most extreme one. The idea was that now, absent communism, all former communist countries will develop on the same pattern. They will all become democratic and capitalist. And we know now that this wasn't the case, and there is a great difference not only between Russia and Poland, but even between Russia and Ukraine. And in both cases, in all of those cases, if you really want an explicatory model, you can't find it in any economic disparities or size, but you have to go back to study the histories of those particular countries or regions, and then you will find that the histories, while they don't totally determine development, have an enormous impact unless you have countervailing powers. And to my mind, one of the consequences of the post-communist development is that we should be much more aware of historical components than just try to have grand theories about universal development or the iron laws of history. I think this is really happening. In the political scene, I'm not so sure it's happening among, in the academia, as it should probably impact paradigm changes in the study of societies and comparative development.
The extent to which thinking will need to be adjusted in the context of, I would call, a non-polar world rather than a multipolar world. And certainly there will have to be a substantial adjustment. But I think, as it were, it may be that there were some supporters of the European Union and of a European model who thought that Europe could reclaim its centrality in the world. I don't know how many people took that seriously. I don't know how many people in Europe even in Europe took that seriously, outside of a few elements in the European elite. I'm reminded of the fact that Paul Valéry in 1919 published an essay called The Idea of Europe, in which he said, the question before Europe, this is in 1919, is whether, having been the mistress of the world, it becomes a promontory of Asia. It's a long time ago, almost 100 years ago. So I think that the adjustment which will be needed will be much greater for the United States, partly because in the last 20 years, and the United States and not Europe has been engaged in projects of intervention, even military intervention, whereas the so-called European model was supposed to be, for those who believed in it, was supposed to be propagated through aid and development and peace processes and so on. In the United States has committed far more. Just give one example of a kind of maybe paradoxical way in which thinking will need to be adjusted, then I will stop entirely. Some people here have been arguing that universalism and power are inherently, the use of power, universalism and imperialism, shall we say, or colonialism, are integrally connected. I think Gianni Vattimo argued that. Well, of course, they have been in European history, but there's no necessary connection between the two. And one of the interesting features of our present non-polar world is we may see, in fact, we already see to some extent, imperialism and the use of hard power with no claims to truth or universality. For example, I don't think that if Russia reasserts some imperial claims over Ukraine or other countries in its near abroad, it will do so by making a universal doctrine of pan-Russianism or it will simply be connected with resources and geopolitical strategy. Similarly, I would not exclude hard power being used by China in future. If issues arise connected with resources or sea lanes, potential conflicts with India, for example, which require hard power, they'll use hard power. But not necessarily making universal claims. So the idea that colonialism or imperialism is necessarily associated with doctrines of moral universalism or other is false historically. Often it hasn't been in the past, and I don't think it will be in the future. So we need to, as it were, understand that many of the critiques of Western society, that internal critics of European and Western society developed, are themselves, as it were, radically internally European and intra-Western, and they won't necessarily have very much application in this non-polar world that we've now entered.
Well, if I can add something, I do not see any power center claiming that it would like to have control over the universe. Not anymore. It is this end of will even in United States, but it is, power is following something else. It is following this wish to control what is necessary, necessity, as excluded from the moral judgment. And of course it is this deep problem of religion, because, you know, it is this secret of God, you know, that what is necessary is somehow excluded from good and right, and it is this dialectic of freedom and necessity. And it is continuity, I think, but at the same time, I do not agree with all these opinions, also in your paper, that Russia is so powerful. Opposite, Russia is now fragmented, surrounded, even Georgia. It is difficult to say who won that war. Georgia invited to NATO. Georgia, invited by Mrs. Rasmussen, visited Georgia a few days ago. Mrs. Ashton saying about starting this process of unification. Georgia as catalyzing mechanism for, let's say, democratic states in Asia. Reorientation of defense trade after that war, when they recognize that defense, you know, that armament from Israel and United States is so much better than from Russia. So, and even Belarus is going not to Poland anymore because of its too symbolically unacceptable for post-communist countries relationship. Symbolic attitudes towards Russia is going to Georgia, to Saakashvili, to communicate with European Commission.
Let me just make one point. I think this is one respect in which the world is moving back into the future. Postmodernity has turned out to be a dream, an illusion, a fantasy. What we're doing, basically, we're in the middle of the modern period. And part of the modern period is things like spheres of influence. And essentially part of American decline is America has conceded a sphere of influence around, in Russia's near abroad. It doesn't matter if it has demographic issues, declining, is a resource-dependent state. All these facts are well known about Russia. But actually its position now is quite a lot stronger since the economic crisis and since George than it was 3 or 4 years ago. And it's partly because of American decline, American contraction. It's been ceded a sphere of influence. That's just a fact. We might not like it, might have to cope with it, might have to adapt to it, or even resist it. But it has already happened.